Welcome to the MacGregor Gallery at DTUC and our current exhibition, which is the work of a young Vancouver Island artist, Ken Gerberick. We're quite fortunate today in having Ken with us, and I think we can ask a few questions about his work, see where he's coming from. The show he has here is quite intriguing in that it's in series or groups that show his chronological development over approximately a 6-year span. And at some place, the audience is sure to be able to come in and understand him. And through talking with him, maybe he can draw us into his philosophy and mode of work. Ken, if I could just inquire of you where your beginnings are. For example, you were an American. You've been up here for about 13 years?
Yeah, since 1969.
Where were you born?
St. Louis, Missouri.
And you took your schooling there?
Yeah, I went to high school there and then worked as a commercial artist around St. Louis and Columbia, Missouri for a number of years, and then went to art school in 66, 67 for the first time in St. Louis.
Were there antecedents in your family life that suggested this is the route you're going to go, an artist, like your family?
No. My grandmother on my mother's side had been an artist, but she had 13 children and had to put her brushes away fairly early and never got back into it. No, my parents were not into it. It was just something that I seemed to do from a very early age, is to draw and paint.
Well, how about school? We find that many artists in the earlier grades, they were always doodling instead of attending to whatever the subject was.
Yeah, I sure did that. But we had a very poor art program in my high school. I was more into writing and literature in high school. I mean, I still painted on my own, but I didn't get any good feedback from my art classes in high school.
As I further ask questions about your background, could we just look at one of your first works here?
But this is probably the earliest. It was done in 1976, I believe, when I was living in a place out in the bush without power and water and all that, and didn't do much but pen and ink illustration. The lighting was very poor there, so all I did was illustration. That was basically all I was into at that time.
I think this work is really quite intriguing in that this is not only part of your lifestyle, but I think you mentioned you had come from the Ozarks and a similar kind of thing was happening there?
Right. Well, this stuff was inspired by scenes that I saw in the Ozarks by wandering way back into the woods and coming across abandoned cars and abandoned homesteads and things like that.
So the car has become quite a strong symbol, both. It's one of your collectibles, as well as one of your subjects in your works.
Right. This car, actually I owned one of these. It was restored, so instead of illustrating it in that manner, I illustrated it as it would be found in the bush.
How about your mechanical capabilities?
Oh, I can wrench enough to keep a car running. I'm not a mechanic.
But you collect them mainly for aesthetic
Yeah, I
reasons.
like the shape.
All right.
Of body parts and of mechanical parts. I love the shapes of pistons and motor blocks and whatever.
I suppose as a young student, it wasn't only art you were interested, you probably were into cars, were you?
Well, I've always been into cars. From my very first toy, I think, was a car.
This other one beside it just sent you an old garage or barn, but I still see that car,
Right.
which...
Right. It was inspired by a barn that I got just a glimpse of out of the corner of my eye when I was up in Campbell River at one point. Came home and made the drawing, illustration.
How about your education in art, which began in the U.S.? Is this the kind of thing you would have been involved in?
That was the kind of thing that I did when I was a kid, and my commercial artwork, I worked as a commercial artist before I went to art school, and that was mainly designing jewelry, which I didn't like. I've never liked jewelry, but I could illustrate it, I could draw it. And when I went to art school, the first time, it more or less opened my painter's eye, and I did all kinds of things and got very involved in the psychedelic art of the late 1960s. But when I came to Canada and moved way back in the bush, it just seemed to fall into pen and ink illustration with just tones of color from watercolor.
To keep these in sequence, which way should we go?
We should go this way. This is
great.
right after I was in art school in Victoria College of Art. I'd gone there because I was just absolutely fascinated with Jack Wise's work. And it happened that in my personal life I ended up in Victoria. And that is one of the earliest pieces under the influence of the kind of Chinese calligraphic brush that I was, that he does so well.
Yeah, I noticed a change from a pen contour to a more general or considered kind of shape. This sort of round or mandala kind of thing, this centering sort of form, is this part of Wise's?
And I had done that
philosophy?
before. The show that I had before I was in art school at a Lemon Tree Gallery in Courtenay was illustrations in in circles and ovals with a design around the edge and an illustration in the center. None in this show. I'm not very proud of that show particularly, but
Yeah, this one is progressed from the first two we've seen. It still has the auto in it, but it's almost subliminal. It's become part of the environment. And I think this is to appear in many we see from now on.
Right.
If we can move on to the next one, I think we can begin to sense the importance of your collectibles on your lifestyle now.
Right. Well, this was from a series of graphite pieces that I did, trying to handle the automobile in as many different ways as I could think of, using, black and white and using graphite. The Oregon 29 is from a 29 Oregon license plate, and it's a rubbing, as is the Rio logo from a hubcap.
And you've sort of collaged those into a drawing as well of...
Right.
They're almost a documentary in some ways. On
some of them in that series were, and some of
friends.
them were almost abstracted.
And the next one, I don't know if the camera can get in close enough, but as we're progressing, we seem to be becoming involved with more detail and more little kinds of things. I know the name of your exhibition, Different Angles, which has much to do with telling the viewer, that you've got a lot more in there than a superficial glance will tell you.
Right. This one is, I see it as a night city scene, probably. It was Ontario Chevy is the name of it, so somewhere in the east, a rainy Ontario city night. That was what the whole thing was supposed to look like, without doing any more than the car is representational and the rest is just sort of indicated.
I know most of your works here that we will be looking at are in color, but it is quite interesting to see the basic black and white quality, the actual draftsmanship that lies underneath all the other works. And that's what we're really seeing now. In this next one, you add color, I see. 1951 Chrysler. We're into color now.
31 Chrysler.
Oh, 31. Pardon me.
Yeah, this is a commissioned, what I call auto portrait. This is a man in Cumberland's car that he commissioned me to paint.
Oh, some people get you to do the
I don't like
children,
doing it.
some their horses, some their dogs, but you do cars.
I do cars.
Right.
I don't do many, but
So
it's one of the best
he's
ones.
kept it in classical condition, has he, as a
Oh,
collector?
it's been restored, yes.
And going to the next one near it, you're playing with words there, Nash Dash, you call it? also in color, but a very close grouping of color harmonies there. I know this one, you're taking a small section of the car. Well, we've been looking at whole cars. Now we're looking at a detail.
Right, it's handled in quite a different manner than the Chrysler was. I wasn't anyways near as concerned about it being representational, though it is. I made the numbers in the speedometer much smaller, and it's not very realistic.
Yeah, we've been looking at the watercolor. Now we're into gouache.
Right. The Chrysler is a gouache piece too.
Is it? Oh. What is your technique with gouache? Are you using minute brush?
Yeah, I use a small Chinese brush.
So this demands a lot of time.
That one took a long time. Yes, it did, because the whole thing is built up of tiny strokes. I would put down a layer of color and then work hundreds and hundreds of tiny strokes over it until I had sort of a texture, and then in some cases go back over it with bigger ones and highlight them.
How about the studio you work in? You mentioned something about that. Has its size got much to do with the size you choose for your work?
Right, I have a very, very small studio. It's half my living room is my studio. I just threw half the furniture out, and that's my home studio. Since I've gotten a bigger studio in the summer, this summer.
And that's where some of the big works we're going to look at came from. You also mentioned that you have a fair acreage on which you're housing all these collectibles. You have all these old cars.
Right, I have 2 acres between Courtenay and Cumberland. That 1 acre is just about solid cars and car parts in the rainforest. Just little clearings made for each car, or each separate thing.
Have you ever inventoried them? Like, how many do you have there?
There's about 25 cars and I don't know how many thousand parts. About 1,000 hubcaps and 400 or 500 license plates, and there's a lot of junk.
What age
Several hundred
range
fenders.
with this?
It goes from the early 20s through the early 50s, basically. Mainly concentrating on the 30s.
And they're just left to the environment to absorb.
Yeah, I clean them off all the time to keep needles and things that may make them rust quicker off of them. But I also plant things in them and around them just so that they look like they've been there for a long time.
Well, while we're on the subject of cars, let's look at this next one, your triptych. I see your title on this one, Ken, Transfiguration of the American Automobile. 1, Part 2, and Part 3. I wonder if you could tell us something about your idea here.
Okay. Part 3 is the first one. Part 2 is the center one, and Part 1 is sort of the end result of the transfiguration, but I did them in reverse order, so they're numbered in reverse order. Which one's the camera on? Doesn't make any difference to me.
Okay, we'll start off for it.
Okay. It's set up very minimalistically with new head gaskets.
Yeah, it's interesting that the ones we've just looked at were the automobile, your collection, are your subject, but here your painting is your collection. The parts are actually incorporated into your painting.
Yeah, that was something that in the beginning of the summer that I had really wanted to do, was make assemblages with some of the junk that I had on hand and incorporate them into painting assemblages.
Did the idea generate through starting, or did this come before, the concept?
Well, it's sort of a continuation of the concept of my site-specific sculpture, my yard sculpture in the country, where I've got about 25 old car bodies and thousands of parts. Some hung in trees and some piled, and forever shuffling them around as pieces come and go.
Yeah, they give a very strong three-dimensional quality to the work, certainly because they are three-dimensional, but they also incorporate some of the qualities, some of the things that happen with automobiles, the rust, the deterioration. And it's interesting the way you have created them, you made them malleable, you've controlled them by the use of paint.
Yeah, the idea for the center one was to have rusty pieces that were completely painted so that there was no rust left, just the texture of rust. And in the first one, which is actually the third of the series, I wanted to have as much rust on the pieces as possible, to keep as much rust, even though they're layered over with paint. It's still very obvious that they are rusty.
What is your support, the thing that you're working on? I know you've got these fastened with bolts.
It's mahogany plywood. They're done on 1/8" mahogany plywood. All these large pieces are on, and they're bolted on.
Is it necessary to gesso in the traditional painter's method?
These were done grounded with solid hide stain, house painting stain, or with semi-transparent stain on the one with the new gaskets is basically semi-transparent stain. And I blended the colors from the walnut to the reddish tint. The center one is blended from a green to a gray. I've gone over it with enough stuff that you can't really see that, but the initial underpainting was a blend of green and gray, solid hide house paint.
What's your philosophy on media? Are you a purist, or whatever works counts?
Having worked with Jack Wise for a couple of years, I was very, very sensitive for a long time to good chemistry, gouache and watercolor on rag paper. And I still do that on my small pieces. These big pieces, I wasn't particularly concerned with that. Whatever worked. They're not long-lived pieces.
As we move from the triptych to the next one, there's a certain continuity in your use of automotive shapes. For example, the head gasket form.
I've always been fascinated with the shape of the head gasket, and I incorporated it into a lot of paintings that were not particularly automotive. That's called industrial forest fire, and it's supposed to be mechanical and industrial seeming. The head gasket seems to be a nice form for
You
that.
have it here, and again you see it
Right.
here.
Along with Pepsi bottles and furnace registers and whatever else I could find that was a pleasing shape.
The added to the connection between the last work, you have other things that are occurring, such as the quality of paint that runs. You know, you seem to be employing the natural quality of paint to run, accidents in other words.
Yeah, controlled accidents. I've experimented with paint enough to know basically what it's going to do, but it's always still an experiment. Where they work, I leave it, and where they don't, I work over it.
Did you see this as landscape? Or would you think of this as non-objective?
Yeah, I see it more as a cityscape as opposed to a landscape.
Because of some of the
Some of the forms.
commercial kinds of things like spray paints and head gaskets and those kinds of things.
Right.
And as we go from this one to the next, we drop the head gasket idea, but we still pick up on the quality of pigment that drips or runs.
Yeah, the title sort of describes the whole thing. It's called The Sky's Bleeding. And it's
Very appropriate. And especially when we begin to look at some of the other color works you have here that are possibly more controlled in their use and their disposition of color. This is one of your louder works in color.
Yeah, I'll say.
You're quite exuberant in your use of color here.
And just about straight primary. Worked back into with the detail and lift off so that it did have a little more to offer than just straight color. There is accidentally controlled detail in the lift off.
So this is the work of this last year?
Yeah, the 11 biggest pieces in the show were done from the first week in June to the last week in September of this year.
So that's in your large studio, your alternative studio.
Right. I did 16 large pieces in that time, and it chose these 11 out for the show.
You seem to change your idea, your thinking, so many things in changing in size. Your use of color, your use of shapes. You seem, in many cases, you seem to abandon controlled detail. What I seem to see here is more energy coming out, sort of flamboyant kinds of things coming out of you.
Yeah, I really wanted to loosen up and really throw some paint around on some bigger pieces. I'd done it with small ones, but even with whatever kind of energy you can do on a small piece, it still has to be fairly controlled. Some of these were just almost out of control. Putting paint on and let it do whatever it was going to do, and if it worked, keep it, and if it didn't, just work back over it.
And certainly this last one has another set of things beginning to happen, very, very optical in the treatment you're giving it. It looks three-dimensional, it seems to undulate, almost like movement of drapes.
Yeah, basically a series of underpaintings, about five or six different washes, and I tried an experiment on them of putting templates down and spraying around them just to see what would happen, and it didn't take much before the piece was developed and finished.
Right. Okay, let's move from here. To this group of watercolors, which is a whole new ball game. Your colors are so subtle here. This is kind of an introversion kind of thing.
Yeah, these were done in, I believe, late '79 and 1980. I was working with fairly subtle watercolors and at the same time with black and white graphite, which is in another series here.
You're beginning to introduce symbolism, other kinds of things in some of these.
Yeah, there's faces and figures starting to
I think if we could get in close
stuff.
enough, I think we'll be getting to see some of these subliminal images. No, it's strange. Many viewers who come into the gallery, they go by the works so quickly. They're caught up in the thing that jumps out and hits them. But some of these have those things that you've got to search for.
Yeah, well, I've been fascinated with subtlety in work for a long time. So if you walk up to a piece, you don't just view it for a moment and you've seen it all. I like my stuff to be much deeper than that, with layers of things and hidden figures and faces and things you have to look for if you're going to see the piece. This one is much newer. This one was done just at the beginning of this year, but again it's a watercolor with gouache and graphite, but mainly a watercolor. But the images in this are not as subtle.
Where are these shapes and things coming from? What are your secrets?
I don't consciously know. I mean,
They just
this one was fairly erotic, and I could see that as the as the underpainting was developing, and that's what I worked on. And some of them, whatever imagery there is, almost subconscious.
Are you ever aware of moods, your own personal moods, aside from attempting to create a mood situation in a work?
No, that doesn't seem to come into my work that much. Quite often when I'm in a state of depression, I do some of my best things, but then again, that doesn't always follow through either.
This particular one, what's the title for this, Ken?
This one's called Fading Pillar, and this is the newest piece in the show that's on paper. It was done just about a month ago. But reverting back to a style that I had worked in some time ago, just trying to develop it a little bit further.
This begins to have a lot of people and faces that I think we're going to see in some other modes of work you get into.
This is true.
Let's move on to the other black and whites you have. Now we're to another mode of working, which is incorporating some of the things we've just looked at, along with some of your early drawing concepts.
Right, and the first of the frontage pieces, rubbing pieces, where the imagery is rubbed off of license plates, hubcaps, emblems, bottles, whatever, and then worked back into with pencils and kneaded erasers. I worked with the watercolor series we saw a few minutes ago, and these in just straight graphite, black and white. And I'd worked both of these series concurrently for almost a year before I was able to put them together in a manner that I felt was satisfactory.
It seems to incorporate some of the surrealistic concepts that you had spoken about earlier, along with that kind of imagery, city landscape, figures happening.
Right, the surreal part of it was very much inspired by studying Salvador Dali and Max Ernst and Rene Magritte. And listening to the 6 o'clock news at the same time, which somehow seemed very relevant.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, the ideas for here, and that's where 6 o'clock news, the environment, the immediate environment.
Right. Well, none of the good news in this day and age, or not much of it anyway, seems to be good news.
No, but you've done some rather intriguing things with it. And in these, while we started with pretty well black and white, with some of the imagery from the previous color ones, you're beginning to introduce that color again, that very subtle watercolor.
Right, with layers of calligraphic strokes, Chinese-style calligraphic strokes, sort of under the surface of the painting.
Now, your imagery, the things that are happening are in a collage fashion, and yet it is all on the one paper, isn't it? They're not separate.
Right. There's no collages here. They're all on the same piece of paper.
Art, you know, is very serious for many people, and I guess here it is. But every once in a while, an element of humor enters your work.
I think that's very essential in art, is to have some humor. It can be just too dry and dull without it.
Your 4x4. What was the title of that one?
Foreground.
Foreground. Can't resist the English language, can we?
I like to play on it.
And this one, I noticed you've used letter forms a great deal.
I have, for years, been fascinated with letters and lettering. I've worked in sign shops and things like that. I was never a very good sign writer, but I've always been fascinated with letters and numbers, just their shapes.
Right. Did your rubbing forms seem to have formed shapes that suggest, you know, city landscape, buildings and that? Which came first, the rubbing or the fitting in a preconceived design?
You mean on how the pieces were executed?
Yeah.
Basically, I would tape my paper down and do the watercolor portion of them first. And then I would untape them from the board because so I could have them the paper free to put on the objects that I was rubbing from. And then quite often that I would go back into them with watercolor again. But basically the watercolor first and then the graphite.
In your rubbing, what kind of a medium are you using? A pencil?
A graphite stick.
A graphite stick.
Right.
Do these require a fixing?
Yes, yeah, the graphite is very heavy on some of these. And even with, well, double fixing, actually I fix them and let them dry and fix them again. And they still, with much pressure, would rub back off.
How about the size of these? They're all convenient size that you can sit and concentrate. Has the size to do with the thing that you're rubbing from?
Yeah, and the size of my studio mainly.
All right.
My drawing board is only 3x4.
So I'm wondering if these kinds of things could ever get to the size of those large canvases we looked at.
They may, but I don't see that is the direction I'm going. I've done enough of these rubbings that I don't feel that I need to do any more.
But let's quickly transfer to another mode yet you were working in. And yet, another mode of work, and the next few will be somewhat like this. Now, the interesting thing here is that these are small, but they're incorporating that exuberance that I found happening in your larger works.
Right, well, I had wanted, I'd wanted at this point to work big, but it just, there wasn't room in my studio, so you sort of go wild in a small space is what I was attempting to do. I had taken a short break of a couple of weeks in my painting last November, and when I got back into it, I got back into it in quite a different manner. I had been controlled and tight in the surreal pieces, and I really wanted to loosen up and let paint fly a bit with the same mediums and different tools. Most of these are palette knife and large brush.
Yeah, they act almost as a therapy for what you're bending, although I know in this one,
This one's
you
more
begin to add control a little of what you just did.
Right. But this was a freak in the process.
And this one seems to free you again.
Right.
How do you feel about them as a mode of working all the time? I mean, it's just a release, or could you go this way?
I think I will continue going this way. I've again taken a short break in the trip here to Nelson and previously to framing the larger pieces. And what I'm back into now is working over old canvases and papers, whether it be mine or somebody else's, using them for an underpainting and just seeing where that's going to go.
Now, in this last one, the concept of idea seems to be entering the picture again. It's just not a release, you're thinking, you're doing
This one was that I had an idea before I started with the piece. It's almost an anti-religious piece called Right Choice in the Garden.
Your thoughts on Adam and Eve?
Yeah, a friend of mine has just gotten into a religious number that I find very oppressing. And this was sort of a statement to him.
If I read a form in here, is this me or is this an intent?
It happened and I didn't work back into it and just left it. Yeah, I see it as sort of a cartoonish face.
Well, it'd be interesting to know, Ken, where you are going from here. What do you see for your future?
I really don't know. I keep painting.
Travel?
I just keep painting. I can't afford to travel. So,
Okay, adjacent to that is the field of art today. You know, what's happening out there? How conscious are you of that, or how does it affect you?
well, I'm fairly isolated up on Vancouver Island, but I get to Victoria and Vancouver occasionally. And I'm interested in the new art that's happening there, especially, I don't know what it could be called, punk art maybe. I find that very fascinating.
I think about 10 years ago someone said art painting was dead, but it still seems to be happening. Do you ever consider the fact that your art might take you out of the realm of painting? Into light, into sound, and so many other things. I note that you are
I think
concerned with music.
Yeah, but I think basically I'm a painter of pictures to hang on the wall. I mean, I'm involved in my yard sculpture and will always continue to be. But I think my basic art, it will be things to be hung on the wall.
Your yard sculpture, do you get many people coming around to look at your cars that are slowly fading into the environment?
There's thousands of photographs taken of it a year. There's any number of people come through. It's gotten
So
to be
you don't
fairly
mind
well-
visitors then?
As long as they keep their hands to themselves, which is not always the case,
Right.
of course.
Yeah, you must have a problem with other people that are collectors too.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Ken, and it's very
You're
good of
very
you
welcome.
to share your work and your philosophy with us.
No, I thank you for inviting me to have a show here in Nelson. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.